Hello everyone, welcome to the session from Colin Johnson. Let's have the pleasure to introduce Colin here. All right, so Colin Johnson is an enterprise agile coach, keynote speaker, author, entrepreneur, and CEO of Pro Kanban. She has been a Kanban coach and trainer for teams, portfolio, and enterprise Kanban systems, and an executive coaching for alignment of lean and agile practices to strategic goals and OKRs. Colleen has been instrumental in the development of end-to-end Kanban systems that marry lean product discovery and lean product delivering to bring visibility, flexibility, and predictability. She's an advocate of application of systems thinking approach to organizational process improvements with a focus on customer first principles and actionable metrics. Among her accolades, she has held several positions as a founder, director, board member, chief product owner, transformation coach, and of course, chief executive officer. Right. So Colleen loves to practice yoga. So again, which is from India, and it's part and parcel of her well-being. So that's a brief introduction about Colleen. So over to Colleen now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's an honor to be a part of this lineup. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here.
Yes, please.
Are you able to see that okay?
It's coming up for me at least. Yes, I can, Colleen.
Great. So my presentation today is really about trying to simplify our approaches to how we scale agility. And my goal today is really just to get you thinking slightly differently about what we're doing when we talk about scaling practices. I'm going to challenge you, and some of these topics may be really different when we think about what we try to scale, when we think about scaling Agile. But I'm going to try to get you to shift the way you're thinking about this and to shift your thinking to scaling flow instead of scaling process. I'll leave some time here at the end of the presentation so we can talk about, you can ask questions and we can talk about what this might mean inside of each of your organizations, depending on where you are in your scaled journey with agility. So let's start out at the top level here. Why are we typically scaling? What are we trying to achieve with scaling? I think when we back away from the process itself, these are some of the reasons we typically hear that an organization wants to scale its Agile practices. They want to be more efficient with the resources that they have available. They want to deliver faster, right? They want to improve their speed and time to market. They want to improve quality and have a higher level of customer satisfaction. They likely want to reduce risk inside the organization with what they're delivering and when. A lot of times when we talk about the processes of scaling Agile practices, a huge part of this is organizational alignment. And that can mean cadences of, delivering on the same cadence. A lot of times when we talk about organizational alignment, though, we're looking for how do we make sure that the work that we're doing at the team level is really connected back up to our overall organizational strategy. So a lot of times we use things like strategic themes or objectives and key results as a way to make sure that the work that we're doing every day at the team level is helping really move the needle on those things that are important to the business. That can get lost really easily without that organizational alignment. And the last one here is transparency and visibility. And when we think about those things, we're often looking at how, back to the alignment piece, how can we make sure that when we say that these things are important to us as a business, that's actually what's happening and what we're delivering. And if that's not true, that we can take action sooner on that. What I see for a lot of organizations is we spend a ton of time and money coming up with strategic themes and OKRs. But by the time the teams get moving on the work that they have in their backlog, they're often working on things that are really just keep the lights on, right? And they're just churning through work really quickly that may not ever connect back up to those strategic themes. And what happens a lot of times is by the end of the year, when we look back and we say, why weren't we able to achieve those goals we had? Why weren't we able to deliver on those things that we said were really important to the business? It's too late, right? It's too late to take action because we've been working on all these other things. And so a lot of times that transparency and visibility piece is often just as important to look at what are we not working on as what are we working on. So all of these things are really core drivers in what we're trying to achieve when we start looking at how to scale process. And we tend to start to look at structure, right? How do we put more structure around all of these things, more rigor, more cadence, more governance, to make sure that we're achieving these things and checking in on the desired outcomes for each of these different goals. So what does the scaling typically look like? Like, how do we do this? Where do we start? I think we typically scale kind of 4 different things, regardless of the type of scaling approach that you're using. The things we're typically looking at are the work, the strategy, the coordination of the work, and the planning of the work. And so thinking about the work itself, this is things like everything happening at the team, program, and portfolio levels, depending on what your structure looks like, and making sure that we've got coordinated delivery across all those different parts of the business. Strategy, like I mentioned, is connecting the work itself to the strategic themes and OKRs and being able to measure progress towards those things. The coordination, right? These are all the day-to-day events that we're doing to make sure that we're all staying connected from a delivery standpoint. So we see this through things like Scrum of Scrums and PMPO syncs and all these different events that a lot of scaling models provide to try to make sure that we're talking on a regular basis about what we're working on and where we might be blocked. And the last one, and maybe the most expensive one, is planning, right? So we do planning typically from a scaled perspective in a very collaborative setting where we're all coming together and talking about risks and dependencies and goals and objectives for what we hope to deliver for a given period of time. These vary and may vary in your organization. I think, I was chatting with somebody yesterday and we were talking about scaled Agile and even kind of how we're seeing more organizations call it safe light, right? So they still want some of the benefit of some of the safe practices, but maybe they're pulling back on some of the rigor around some of these different practices as they're prescribed from a safe perspective. And I see a lot of companies too, where they pick and choose a little bit. Maybe they're using a little bit of Scrum at scale and a little bit of safe and a little bit of less. And they're choosing to kind of pull together the best of each of those practices to fit their specific needs and context. But what often happens? So let's talk about the downside, right, of scaling process, which is really what a lot of these different models are actually scaling. This is really complex, right? So a lot of the models, safe especially, is introducing a lot of new roles, new practices, new taxonomy that requires a lot of expensive training. And this is, I've been working in the space over the last couple of years, and the amount of overhead it requires just to switch things that are as simple as we're going to call an initiative an epic, right? Or we're going to call a task, a story. These things are hard to change in a lot of organizations, especially when there's a lot of different tools already in place and you're trying to shift tooling to support changes to practices and taxonomy. The same is true with roles. The cost of shifting all of these roles into new titles, new responsibilities takes a long time. It's not as easy as just saying we're going to take this part of our business and make them all product managers, right? It takes a long time to become a great product manager, for example. So there's a lot of complexity here in trying to adopt some of these new practices. I think at the team level, one of the things we hear the most is that it is time consuming. That there's a lot of overhead on a lot of events that really rely on a lot of heavy upfront planning. Those planning events rely on a lot of time-consuming estimation effort. And what we see is that we're often wrong as soon as we start. That first sprint in, we tend to be, if we miss our goals or we miss our deliverables for that first sprint, we're wrong for the rest of that time box or that maybe program increment if you're working in that model. So there's a lot of overhead involved in a lot of these practices too. And the last one here is that it's very rigid. And so there tends to be a lot of A lot of that upfront planning tends to result in a lack of flexibility. And so I think as a whole, a lot of businesses value the plans more than they value the flexibility. And so we spend all this time and money trying to get plans together and publish plans and hold everyone to those plans. But what ends up happening is all of that structure makes it very hard to change our course, which is really what we wanted with Agile in the first place, is the ability to respond to new things coming in and be flexible with what we're delivering. And so a lot of the planning effort locks us into long-term deliverables and long-term plans that we may need to change as we uncover new things and learn and get feedback from our customers. So those three things, I think, kind of encompass some of the pain we feel when we typically apply some of these different scaling models. So I'm going to propose three things that I think are our first steps towards simplifying some of these scaling practices. I'm saying that how do we simplify scaling? I also realize these are not easy changes to make. And so one of the things I'd love to hear from the group when we go to the Q&A block here is what would be the easiest of these three to implement in your organization? Let's start with planning. So let's talk about planning here. I think the cycle of planning is always a really interesting one. And I'd love to learn more about the psychology of why we love plans so much. I fly a lot for work and travel a lot for work. And it's always kind of a joke in our house that I'll call my husband from the airport and be so frustrated because I'm like, my flight's delayed and now I have to sit here and now I'm not going to get into where I'm trying to go on time. And he always says, I don't know why you're so surprised by this. Every time you fly, it's delayed. That should be the normal expectation. But it's because I had a plan. I had a plan for when I was going to get there and when I was going to land and where I was going to go eat and how long it was going to take me to get to my office or my destination. And as soon as I lose control of that plan, I feel like I've lost control of where I'm going next. And I think this is why we get so stuck and those plans feel so rigid, is because we put in all this effort, right? We put in all this energy into coming up with that plan. And the minute it goes awry, then it's almost like we feel a stronger gravity towards trying to course correct instead of embracing that change and kind of going with the flow. So when we start to think about how we could stop planning, what does that look like? So instead of going through these long, whether it's quarterly or however often you're doing planning at scale, what we want to shift to is this concept of just in time. And how do we start to look at all levels of our system as a pull system so that we're only picking the next highest priority item to work on when capacity comes available. And that means that we have to have a WIP controlled system. So when we talk about what this looks like in practice, one of the first things is being flexible with change, right? And not every organization is comfortable with this. It does take time. But I think one of the most powerful benefits of a pull-based system is your ability to respond to change and embrace that change. And that means that as new things come in, as new priorities come in, you're able to move that to the top of your queue or to the top of your funnel because you haven't planned for 3 months in advance what you're going to be working on. As soon as space comes in, you can say that this is now the highest priority thing for us to be working on. And so we're going to move that to the top, and it's going to be the next thing that we pull. This also helps just in terms of planning. If you can move away from that long-term planning cycle, this is also going to enable your teams to be working with the most relevant information. So it's a kind of an anti-pattern that we spend all this time and energy estimating and forecasting, and then things go into the backlog. And we may not be working on them again until halfway through next year. So by the time we go to pull that work in, we've forgotten how we pointed it. We've forgotten the architecture diagrams or the architecture design. And so we're starting back over anyway by the time we go to pull that work in. So by working just in time, you're also getting the most relevant information right before that work starts. This also gives us the ability to respond quicker. We talk a lot in Agile practices about being able to respond to customer feedback. But I think most of the organizations I've worked with are not great at this. We talk about folding that feedback in, but what it often means is we gather that feedback and it goes to the bottom of our backlog, right? Especially if we've planned really far out. most organizations have created plans so far out that it's very difficult for them to respond to that customer feedback without creating a lot of churn. So think back to the airport example, right? How do we make it so that if my flight's delayed, there's some flexibility? I'm approaching those plans with greater flexibility so that I can respond easily when the flight is delayed. The same thing is true here. So as things change, as customer feedback comes in, we want to give our organization and our teams the ability to pivot more quickly as things shift. And the last thing from a planning perspective is that we have to reduce some of the bureaucracy that's typically involved with planning. And so how can we start to either front load some of that effort or start to chip away at some of the things that often slow down our decision making? What I see for a lot of organizations as they shift to more pull-based, just-in-time systems at scale is that work gets pulled in and then gets blocked because it has to go through some approval process. So what we want to try to do is identify where those things truly need to happen and shift them to the left. And so that way we're starting to say if there's approvals, if there's security steps, if there's review processes that need to take place, how do we move those earlier in our process so that work isn't getting stuck? And that becomes really important from a planning perspective because I think everyone has a tendency to plan once the work starts instead of trying to get in front of understanding what steps need to be true so that the work is truly ready when we pull it into in progress. And again, we want to do that just in time instead of months in advance. So this other part here of reducing the bureaucracy means that we have to figure out what's really required for work to move and what's really required for work to be ready. So that we're chipping away at some of those layers where work gets stuck. So what we want to shift to here is pull over plan. And how we do that is by implementing WIP limits. We tend to focus a lot on WIP limits at the team level. And I know many scaling models propose WIP limits at, maybe at the program or portfolio level. I almost think that there's more bang for your buck in starting at the top with WIP limits. Because if you're implementing WIP limits, let's say at your epic level first, that's going to bring more focus and direction at the feature level. And the same is true at the feature level. If you have WIP limits that you're adhering to at the feature level, that's going to trickle down and bring more focus to the team level. Implementing WIP limits starts to create that decision-making mechanism. And that means that your WIP has to be at a level where it's creating some pressure based off of your capacity to choose what to work on next. And then that means that we don't plan until we have capacity, right? It's just in time. So when there's capacity in the system, we pull the next highest priority item instead of trying to plan months in advance what we're going to be working on. So that's our first one. We're going to stop planning and use pull systems over planning. Number two, this is probably a fun one. We're going to stop estimating. Let's talk about the downsides of estimating here. And there are many downsides of estimating. What we want to shift to here is the ability to forecast and do forecasting with past throughput data, not just at the team level. And you may be familiar with some of the concepts of running Monte Carlo simulations for team level data, but we want to start forecasting things like features and epics so that we can start to say, here's how long things will take. Here's how many, based on maybe running multiple epics in parallel, here's the impact that's going to have on our delivery time. And being able to do that with past data is going to give you a higher degree of accuracy and require less people power to answer those questions. So let's talk about what that looks like. When we shift to looking at forecasting versus estimating, it allows the teams to focus on doing the actual work, right? So if you think about how much time we spend trying to estimate work, whether that's through things like story pointing sessions or things like backlog refinement sessions, we spend a lot of time talking about the work that we're going to do in the future. And that's expensive. It's not just expensive from a time perspective, but it's pulling focus away from delivering value. It's it's context switching for the teams. And we can actually forecast with a higher degree of accuracy if we have more delivery data to do so. So for example, instead of pulling the team off to estimate, if I'm getting more value delivered, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to have more throughput data that I can use to forecast, and I'm going to have more customer feedback that I can respond to. So delivering value is more valuable to us as an organization than estimating future work. This helps reduce the overhead we talked about at the beginning. So as teams start to look at ways that they can work more efficiently, we want them to be using their time to get that stuff out the door. So that's, if we think about what we're trying to do as an organization, we're trying to deliver value, right? We don't need to be perfect at estimating, and we probably never will be. So how can we reduce some of that focus and get the teams really focused on delivering that value? And the last one here is improving our adaptability. So when we think about that adaptability we talked about, making it easier to adjust priorities and adjust to that customer feedback, forecasting really enables that in a greater way because we're just looking at the count of items rather than what we're delivering. And I think that's a common misconception when we talk about predictability. I see a lot of chatter, especially right now in LinkedIn, around Agile was never supposed to be predictable. And I think that could be true if we're talking about what we're delivering, but we still have to be predictable and reliable with when we're going to be delivering. We try to do that through things like averaging out our velocity, but what ends up happening for a lot of organizations is there's variability sprint to sprint because of carryover work or work taking longer than the sprint time box that start to make it so that we can't rely on that team's velocity in order to really accurately estimate. When we're thinking about things from a probabilistic forecast perspective, it starts to give us the ability to create a budget. And so if I were able to tell you that this team can deliver 20 stories in the next 3 weeks, as a product person, you have the ability then to pick what those highest priority 30 stories are and to continue to adjust based on the feedback that you're getting. So instead of feeling like you are locked into a specific 30 stories, you now have a budget to understand, based on this team's pace and delivery history, what are the highest priority items that I need to keep giving this team to work on, knowing that this is how much work we can probably get done in the next 3 weeks. And so this gives you a lot more flexibility. We're not locked into what, we're just making sure the team is continuing to deliver at a consistent pace. So instead of estimates, we want to shift to this concept of forecasts. I had a chance at the beginning to talk with Raju a little about the weather. The weather is a great example of how we want to think about forecasting. We want to use historical throughput data, which is going to give us some interesting things about the team's information. What I see a lot of companies do who estimate, they go through long cycles of estimation. The teams come back with a rough idea of how long they think a feature or an epic or a project is going to take. And then the company goes, well, we'll add 30% or we'll add 50% to whatever the team came up with. And I'm like, why? And they, it's usually like, well, we have to have a buffer because we're always wrong with our estimates. What's kind of magical about using historical throughput data is all the stuff that's hard to account for is already baked into that data. So if we know that this team deals with a high degree of unplanned work or a high degree of production support issues, that is going to be reflected in that team's past data. We don't need to try to buffer to come up with some kind of way to account for that. That means we want to use throughput data that is like for like with what we're forecasting in the future. So if I'm forecasting an effort that is going to span over, let's say, November and December and likely be impacted by the holidays, I might want to look at last year's November and December throughput data. I probably wouldn't want to use November and December's throughput data to forecast a project for February and March because I'm going to have different availability. The more data we have, that probably comes out in the wash. But we want to start to look at what historical data can we use to forecast without the overhead of trying to understand all of the work with a high degree of certainty, which is often required for estimating. This is a quick example of a tool that you can use to forecast when your work is completed. This is a screenshot from a tool called Actionable Agile. And it is showing selected throughput here at the top. So each dot here that you see at the top is how many work items were completed on a given day. You can see here across the bottom, there's a bunch of days where there are 2 dots together and 0 items were completed. those are likely the weekends, and weekends are included in these Monte Carlo simulations, or are recommended to include in these simulations, because if you're trying to communicate with your customers and stakeholders when something will be done, they want to know how many days from today, a calendar day, not business days, or have to do the math to say, well, we have 2 holidays or two more weekends between now and then. So we always work just in calendar days. And then what you can see here across the bottom is, based on that selected throughput data, we're going to run 10,000 random trials of that data. And the bell curve you see here is how many times we hit that number with our trial. So if I said, how many items could I complete in 20 days? This is going to randomize this data, run it through 10,000 trials. Just think of a dice roll, right? That's really what's happening behind the scenes here. We're saying, based on what's above here, how many times did I come up with a total of 30 items in 20 days? How many times did I come up with a total of 38 items in 20 days? And so we get this bell curve here of how many times we had that output, that number of outputted items for a 20-day period. Then we're able to create these vertical lines of the distribution of that data set. So 70% of our items could be drawn. We can see that line here. I know these are a little hard to see on the screen. And then we can say that there's a 70% chance that we'll complete 33 or more items in 20 days. I can move further to the left here and say there's an 85% chance we'll complete 29 or more items, and a 95% chance we'll complete 25 or more items. What you can see here is, as my likelihood goes up, my confidence, basically, as my confidence increases, the number that I'm committing to goes down. And what this gives us is the ability to talk about risk. So now we can go to our stakeholders and say, how much risk are we comfortable with being wrong? So this is telling us that this team, if I was wrong, if I'm comfortable being 5% likelihood of being wrong, I might use 95th percentile and only commit to 25 items to start. If I'm comfortable being half wrong, maybe there's a 50%, there's not a high risk here of being wrong. I might use 50% and pull more work in and say we can probably complete 38 items in the next 20 days. What's important about this, though, when we think about those things we just talked about, is I don't know what these items are, and I don't have to. I can define the work right as I'm pulling it in and right size that work to make sure it fits into my team's SLE, or service level expectation, based on cycle time data. And that gives me the ability to keep the team focused on delivering value instead of estimating future work. All right, number 3. The number 3 thing I think we need to stop doing to simplify scaling is to stop time boxing. And I know this one's probably the scariest for a lot of folks. But when we think about what we do when we time box, there's a lot of unintended consequence to trying to time box. And I know our first reaction is probably thinking of a sprint time box, but we tend to apply the same thinking around those time boxes, even more so as we start to scale Agile practices. So from a safe perspective, this typically looks like a PI, which might be 10 or 12 weeks. Some organizations just stick with quarters, calendar quarters, for a cadence, but we tend to always look at how we are moving work through our organization in terms of these time boxes. What we want to shift to here, and this kind of ties back to our pullover plan, is a continuous flow of work. It's really interesting to me. We've been talking a lot in the pro Kanban space about all the things that we've tried to make more continuous over the last decade, right? We have continuous integration and continuous improvement and continuous delivery. We even have a continuous discovery book out right now, right, about the product side of continuous discovery, but we still work in time boxes to deliver value. So how do we start to think about a continuous flow of work at every level of our organization? The first thing is we want to prioritize quality. So one of the anti-patterns I see with time boxes is that even though we're trying to smooth the work out inside those time boxes, there tends to be a big push at the end to get things done. I think this is especially, we see it inside sprints where everything moves to quality, the quality review or the testers at the end of the sprint. We see this at the feature level, right, where features may stay in progress for a long period of time until some of the work is at the very end and everything can be tested together or reviewed together. And especially at the epic level, right? So I see a lot of epic level work where there's often like a cleanup feature planned at the very end, where it's like we need to go back and tie it all together and test it all before it can be deployed. These time boxes enable some of that practice, right? Or they encourage some of that practice, because we're constantly leaving things till the end of the time box or the end of that deadline to go back and make sure it's ready to go. If we're working in a continuous flow model, it gives us the time and the focus to make sure that we're delivering with quality throughout the process. And so that time box goes away. You may have a step to ensure quality, right? Or a phase of your workflow, but it's happening all the time. It's not happening just at the end. And this can require a little bit of a shift in how we break our work up to make sure that our work is broken up in a way where it's as independent as possible, still as small as possible, and can move through that system by itself. The next one here is simplifying our delivery. And that kind of ties back with what we were just saying, right? So what I see a lot for organizations working with a time box, particularly at the program or portfolio level, is that they tend to use the time box to fill with work, right? So let's take a PI, for example. If you have a 12-week PI, you may say all of our features need to be about 3 months worth of work. Well, what happens is we pack that feature with 3 months worth of work, and then it carries over to the next PI when it's not ready to go. But it often gets stuck in the next PI, even if it's completed, until it's ready, until that PI ends. And so what could have been 4 months worth of work now takes us 6 months to get to the customer. So these time boxes tend to create some artificial windows with when we can deliver things, whether that's internal reviews or customer reviews or even just a release cadence. So getting rid of those time boxes can start to give your organization more flexibility of when they're going to release their features. And then customers are starting to get things real time. I also mentioned that downside of trying to fill the time box, right? So I hear that a lot. Features should take about 3 months. But what if you could get a feature out in 1 month? Why wouldn't you want to do that? And so we want to focus on how do we get them as small as possible so they can move through the system quickly and get delivered to the customer as soon as possible. All of these things are going to help you with better alignment, right? So at the beginning of this, we talked about one of the goals of scaling Agile practices being responsiveness, and how do we make sure that we're delivering what customers want when they want it. The further out we try to plan and lock ourselves into those plans and time box the delivery of that value, the harder it is for us to make sure that we're meeting our customers' expectations and that we're able to give them what they want when they want it. So getting rid of those time boxes and really focusing on a continuous flow of delivery to the customers is going to help you do that better. So we want to shift away from those time boxes and focus on flow. And when we think about flow and think about what we're trying to scale here, we want to scale flow through our system at every level. And that means managing the work on an individual work item level and shifting our focus rather from time boxes to what we call, I mentioned that term, service level expectation. That really just means how long should individual items in our workflow take? How long is too long? And you can set those service level expectations at the epic level, the feature level, or the story level. And it's an interesting conversation, right? As soon as we know how long things are starting to take, we can have a conversation about how old is too old. That means making things visible on your board. We have a colleague at ProKanban who shared a story about using turkey stickers to put a sticker on a physical board every time a feature had been in progress for another month. And so by the end of a couple months, they started having all these features that were covered in turkey stickers because they had been in progress for so long. A lot of times we can't see that in the tooling that we use. So we have to get creative about making work item age visible. And when we think about feature and epic level, this becomes especially important as we start to try to plan again, right? When we're planning work and we still have work in progress, that maybe you have a feature in progress right now that's been there for 120 days. Is planning a new batch of work really important right now? So making that work item age is visible is a great way to start to manage flow and to look at what things you need to focus on getting done first before you're planning new work. So if you can, try to avoid those time boxes and focus on continuous flow. So let's go back to the beginning. We talked about why. Why are we scaling? What are we trying to do with scaling? If we're trying to do these things, right? If we're improving efficiency, we want to try to get rid of some of that overhead we talked about. How do we reduce the overhead required to deliver consistently, predictably, and with high quality? We talked about enhancing quality by getting rid of the time boxes that create pressure to rush and get things over the finish line because our time box is ending. And with faster time to market, that should say market, sorry, it says marker. Faster time to market, we want to think about things like how can we respond as quickly as possible and reduce the batch size of the things that are in progress. Looking at things like work item age as a way to manage the flow of things to done is going to help us focus on delivery and faster time to market. We want to reduce the risk in what we're working on, and that's going to come from things like pull versus plan, right? Being able to pull things in right when we're ready to start working on them, when we have the capacity instead of spending a lot of time trying to plan things. And then again, reducing the size and scope of how many things we have in progress as an organization. You can do all these things without giving up organizational alignment, right? So creating that structure where you're saying, how are we going to start to look at the strategic themes or the OKRs or the BHAGs that this organization has put forward? You can start to visualize that through every level of work or Kanban board that you have below that. And that can help create that organizational alignment and give you the visibility and transparency you need to make sure that you're working on the right things sooner. All right, so here's your takeaways. Number one, we want to pull over plan. Number two, forecast over estimates. And number three, continuous flow of work over time boxes. I think that simplifying these processes will help you with all the reasons that you probably started scaling Agile practices in the first place. And especially in a time like now where we're seeing a lot of organizations making big cuts to headcount and big cuts to staffing, especially around the Agile roles and responsibilities. I think these things are going to become even more important. So we're going to have to be able to do more with less, be more responsive, and do really focus on how we're serving our customers as quickly as possible. If you liked some of this content and you're interested in learning more, we have an Applying Scaled Portfolio Kanban class through prokanban.org. My colleague at ProKanban, Pratik Singh, just put out an incredible book called Scaling Simplified. I highly, highly recommend that book. He's got some great stories and examples around a lot of what we talked about here today. And if you are familiar, if you prefer your scaling content with a side of whiskey, I would encourage you to check out the Drunk Agile YouTube channel with Pratik Singh and Daniel Vacanti. They have a lot of great topics there that you can also dig into on how to scale effectively, efficiently, and predictably. Let's open it up for some questions.
You can use a Q&A panel, anyone, if you have a question.
It's Friday night for you all. I'm sure you're not thinking of scaling Agile on a Friday night, right?
But Collen, how do you convince somebody? You are like curved balls, like no planning, no estimates. My God, all these leaders will go crazy.
Even I was thinking the same thing. It's kind of like very difficult to kind of suggest or can even recommend these kind of suggestions. So how do you convince people or organizations to have such kind of environment?
These are big changes. And so I think picking one area to work with first, instead of trying to do it across the whole organization, is a great place to start. Pick an area where you feel like they're going to be open and receptive to experimenting, and use that as a way to create a little bit of a business case and an example for how this can work. I think the easiest thing to start with is the forecasting. So even if you're still doing PI planning, and you still have those time boxes, I think starting with forecasting at the epic and feature level, where you're using a Monte Carlo simulation to say, for this portfolio, here's what our epic data looks like, and here's how we could forecast when things will be done, especially at the feature level. I think feature level is probably where I would go first with forecasting. And I think that that can be done without making any changes to how your team is estimating now. So what I like to do is start to pull that data into PI planning and say, okay, before we start planning 5 more features, we have 5 features still in carryover from the last PI. We have 5 features from the PI before that. Like, let's look at some of this data. Let's look at how long things are taking us, how many stories are typically in each of these features. And really getting into some of the data behind it to start the conversation then around, should we be pulling 5 more things in? Like, do we need to plan 5 more features for this PI if nothing is leaving the system? And that conversation then becomes a little easier. I think if you have those WIP limits in place, you can start to show versus tell a little bit around the WIP limits and how that pull system can really start to create that pressure. But that's where I would go first, focusing on forecasting features. And I think there's some great tools. I know Actionable Agile just put one out. I think it's an epic level forecaster, but it gives you the ability to also see the impact of an increased WIP. So a lot of the forecasting tools available are telling you, if I'm only working on one feature at a time, how long will it take me to deliver that feature? But that's not the reality for most teams. We're working on many things at once, and especially when we start trying to forecast across a whole program. So how do we start to say, if I increase my WIP to 3 features, how long will they take? If I increase my WIP to 10 features, how long will they take? And that can also be a great driver for the conversation around putting WIP limits in and following those WIP limits instead of pushing more work in each PI. What have you seen? Has that, maybe you guys are in organizations that are more successful at this, but I'm curious what you've seen around PI planning and the ability to adhere to WIP limits.
Yeah, it's been different experience. I think at least I have not seen many teams use WIP limits. So that's been the biggest challenge, even if we try to kind of explain them. So they find it hard to understand because we are kind of so tuned to this kind of like assigned work and all those things. So yeah, it's another challenge.
We have a question here from Chris Mason.
Chris.
Yes, it's there in the Q&A. Collen?
Yeah, from a scaling standpoint, when you suggest stop planning, how do we deal with the funding justification side without planning? And no problem, Chris, about typing it instead of asking it with your mic. So I think there's a couple things here. Initially, I don't think you need to change much around your funding model. Typically, especially if you're using scaled Agile framework, a lot of that funding happens at the LPM level and it happens at the epic level. And that doesn't necessarily have to change if you're stopping PI planning. So you would still be able to have the same check-ins around what are we spending? Do we want to keep investing based on when features deliver? I would also argue you might see that you're having that conversation more frequently without the time boxes of the PI cadence. I think most organizations do things like the portfolio strategic reviews quarterly. That tends to be what I see. And I think that's usually when we're checking in, but that conversation around, do we want to continue to invest in this epic and how are we tracking with our leading indicators and things like that could happen a lot more often if we were delivering features more often. And that's where I think we tend to lock ourselves into what we're going to deliver because we're using those time boxes to dictate when we're doing those reviews and having those conversations. Does that help, Chris?
Yeah, I do have one more question, Collen, if you don't mind. So I do understand where you're coming from, this stop planning and stop estimation, all those things. Now that I think organizations, teams are so much tuned to this kind of, let's say, PI planning or sprint planning and so on and so forth. So when you go and kind of like teach these things, like stop these things, so what are challenges do you overcome? What are challenges you face?
I think fear, right? Because like I mentioned at the beginning, I think plans give us a false sense of security. And I think we like feeling like we know where we're going to be a week from now, 2 weeks from now, 3 months from now. But the reality is if we're trying to be agile in what we're delivering, we have to be flexible. We have to embrace that things will change. And I think one of the things that I see a lot for organizations that have adopted some different types of scaling frameworks is when they start to pull away from them or back away from some of the practices, it's often because they feel like they can't get the things done they need to get done when they have to happen, right? So we planned all this work, but all this unplanned stuff came in, production support, market shifts, depending on what industry you're in. It can be security changes, right? I've done some work in crypto over the last couple of years. That's really volatile, right? And so as things come in and you have to change direction quickly, that's usually when we abandon all these practices anyway, because it's like, well, we can't do this. We can't plan. I can't plan what's out there for 3 months. And so I think the fear of not having control is what usually holds people back until they see the power of being able to respond. And that's a slow change. I mean, it's a cultural shift for a lot of organizations to trust that we're going to be able to respond to what we need to in the moment. I typically don't try to stop, like all the things we just talked about. I wouldn't go into a company and say, we're going to stop PI planning. They would panic and probably show me the door. But what I try to do is introduce a lot of these practices alongside PI planning to the point where they might say, it doesn't feel like we need PI planning anymore, right? Like, or maybe we need a half-day session for the teams to just check in and demo what they've been working on, or, you know, how do we adjust those things so that they fit our needs, but so we're delivering continuously, work is flowing continuously, you know, and we're doing all of those things as work is completed. We're pulling work in as it's completed instead of just around those time boxes. So fear holds us back from many things, unfortunately.
All right. Any further questions? I don't see any. Oh. No, I don't see any further questions.
Chris Mason has got many, and we will take Chris is our person to take up. So
That sounds
we'll
great,
connect
Chris.
Chris with Collen.
Yeah, if
Yes.
you're interested in keeping the conversation going, the easiest way to get in touch with me is through the prokanban.org Slack channel. If you go to prokanban.org under the About Us, you'll find a link to join Slack. It's an open community and free for anyone who would like to talk more about flow. It's our favorite 4-letter F word over at ProKanban. So feel free to join there, and you can DM me any other questions that you think of afterwards. So thank you all for joining. And Raji, thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this today.
Thanks,
Thank you so
Collen.
much, Collen. Thanks. It's great insights.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you
Thanks,
in next
everyone.
10 minutes.
All
Yep.
right. Sounds
Thank
great.
you. See you all in the next session.
Happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
Bye.